Hello and welcome to the next in OCF's Ocean Justice webinar series. Today we'll be focusing on decolonising the ocean sector. This is the third in our series of webinars generously supported by the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. My name is David Tudor. I'm one of the directors of Ocean and Coastal Futures. OCF is a convener of change in the ocean sector, and through this series of webinars we're creating a space to learn, discuss and debate ocean justice. We've got a brilliant panel and chair. We're very grateful for giving up their time today. But before that, just a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you online have got your cameras off and you're all muted. You'll see at the top of your screen there's a chat function. Please use this to introduce yourselves to each other if you'd like, and also exchange any links or any resources. You'll also see at the top a Q&A function right next to the chat. So please use this to pose any questions you have to the panel. And if you like a panel question that somebody else has posed, please upvote it. Just to say that some versions of Teams may have problems seeing this, so if you do, please use the chat and someone in the team will move it over into the Q&A. So now I'm just going to hand over to the chair for today. So the chair is Dr. Gurpreet Padda, many strings to her bow, and the founder of Black Ocean Citizens. Over to you, Gurpreet.
Oh, thank you, David. That was a great introduction. So yeah, I'm Gurpreet Padda. I wear multiple hats, and one that really gets the fire burning is Black Ocean Citizens. Black Ocean Citizens is a UK-based non-profit aimed at promoting the voices of people of colour and underrepresented communities in ocean sciences for better ocean governance and conservation outcomes. Now, there are four main branches to Black Ocean Citizens. That's one, researching the historical associations of enslavement, indentured service, the flows of development aid and governance around that. There's also unpicking how knowledge on the ocean sector is being gathered from marginalised and unrepresented communities, the nature of helicopter and extractive research, both in the UK and in the global south, and who are the beneficiaries of this research. There's also, through educational programmes, Black Ocean Citizens is partnering with schools and research organisations to eventually bring diverse perspectives into ocean sciences. And then the fourth branch is community activism involving collaborating with allies, who you'll hear from shortly. And that's not only in marine sciences, but other organisations aiming at highlighting unjust and inequality in the field they work in, such as health inequalities, terrestrial ecology, for example. So Black Ocean Citizens was founded after being completely dispirited about how few Black and brown people were visibly present in the sector, the demographics of those leading conversations on ocean governance and how the conversations of 20 years ago hadn't really evolved. You can read much more about Black Ocean Citizens from the website and my journey into ocean sciences. And you can follow Black Oceans on Blue Sky. So I will now ask for the panelists to put on their cameras, if they will, and I will just introduce each of them. Are you all there? So we're just waiting for got everyone now, I think. Okay. So there's Surabhi Ranganathan from the University of Cambridge, who is currently in Delhi. And there's Ashish Ghadiali from Radical Ecology. There's Joe Ogogo from the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Aquaculture Science. And then we have Cyan Deslandes from the University of Plymouth. So I'll run, the running order will be from, I'll start with Surhabi, who will talk about her research, and then I'll move on to others in the panel. So Surhabi, over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Gurpreet. Good afternoon, everybody from Delhi. Good morning to you in the UK. I'm really pleased to be here to just tell you a little bit about myself. I teach international law at Cambridge, and my research is in the history and politics of international law, particularly as it has to do with the making of the ocean through the law. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So my talk today asks, what does law have to do with decolonizing the ocean sector? And I want to suggest to you that there are two aspects to its role. So just before I get started, let me show you, let me share my screen. All right. So I want to suggest to you that there are two aspects to the role that law has to play in decolonizing the ocean sector. Firstly, law is part of the problem. So if the ocean sector needs to be decolonized, then it is because the colonial ocean has been produced through the actions of international law. And secondly, and perhaps more hopefully, law, including legislative, interpretive, institutional, and judicial processes, is also a key site of world making, that is, of contestations over what is and what needs to be done. And this aspect of the law generates, I will suggest, particular responsibilities for legal scholars like myself. So, to understand why law is part of the problem, let's review how the ocean is produced through law. The maps on the screen in front of you used to be hosted on the UN webpage for decolonization. And they were intended to provide a snapshot of how the world had changed from a world of empires to a world of states. But focus here on how both maps depict the ocean. Both show it as an absence, as a blank and featureless space. And this empty ocean is not an oversight. It is, in fact, a culmination of map-making techniques that were developed hand in hand with colonialism in the 17th and 18th centuries. So previously, maps like the Carta Marina of 1539 that you see on the slide in front of you had shown the ocean as a place full of human life and attachment. And yet, as you can see in the second map, the Berlin map of 1768, by the middle of the 18th century, the ocean had become rendered as an abstract space. It had become a sort of great void over which, as the literary historian Isabel Hofmeyr reminds us, power could be projected. The ocean became defined by the doctrine of the free sea, which is to say a sea that was free for imperial navigation, fishing, and trade. It is this great void that is reproduced today in the UN maps. And as Hofmeyr further reminds us, there is much that it conceals in its representation of the oceans. So let us now look at all that we don't get to see in the UN map of the blank ocean. We don't get to see how, since the world of 1945, national jurisdiction has extended far into the sea, with states making extensive claims to sea waters and the ocean floor. We don't get to see how areas which are formally still international are actually enclosed within mining contracts, within the remit of fisheries management organizations, and as marine protected areas. We don't get to see how fully international shipping occupies the ocean surface. We also don't get to see the spread of submarine cables over the ocean floor, nor the accumulation of plastics in the ocean. And most hauntingly, perhaps, no maps can show us the graves of those who were drowned by the Atlantic slave trade. I could carry on in this vein, showing you the many things that are actually obscured in the picture of the blank ocean. But let me now try to bring together some of the maps that I've shown you. So please here, forgive my bad photoshopping skills. But here's what we get, a crowded ocean. And this crowded ocean too is a product of the law, although in this case now, 20th century law, not simply the old free sea doctrine. The law of the sea has much developed in the past decades via hundreds of international agreements, thousands of pages of text, and even a new constitutional framework in the form of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and its implementing agreements. Yet, for all of its complexity and volume, the new law of the sea also erases the ocean as a historical, social, and ecological space, effectively simplifying it into a series of sites for extraction and for the accumulation of profit. The law does so in several steps. Firstly, it defines the ocean as composed of different zones that are distinguishable by distance from the shore and by depth, that are distinguishable by medium, so it's broken up into seabed and seawater zones, and that are distinguishable by different functions. So, for example, specific zones for customs and sanitary inspections. Thereafter, the law defines the contents of the ocean and assigns these to various zones. And in doing so, and this is important, it even remakes the specific properties of much that it allocates to the jurisdiction of different zones. So we learn, for example, through law that corals, legally speaking, live on the seabed but not in the water, which would come as a surprise to anyone who has had any interaction with corals. We also learn that crustaceans, for example, do not swim. Again, that would catch your average prawn by surprise. But the law does a lot of this, remaking the specific physical properties of the things that it then, as it tries to allocate them to different parts of the ocean. And finally, having divided the ocean spatially and allocated its contents, the law attaches normative value to the exploitation of ocean resources, for example, by linking fisheries to the ideal of optimum utilization and linking the mining of seabed minerals to the ideal of realizing the common heritage of mankind, which is lofty words for what is essentially an extractive activity. It is important then that when we talk about oceanic perils today, such as warming of the waters, pollution, biodiversity loss in the ocean, and ecological and social harms produced by all of this, we recognize the role that the law and international law, the law of the sea, various bodies of law have played in bringing these perils about. But if the law is part of the problem, it is also important to recognize it as a site of world making, because it is important to realize that this ocean, this crowded yet emptied ocean and imperiled ocean, is neither natural nor given. So rather, the ocean we have now is the product of contestations between different politico-economic projects that had sought to find a grounding in the law. And some of these projects were far more radical and far more imaginative than those that won out in the end. In the 1960s and 70s, for example, that is in the heat of what is popularly called the decolonization era, various third world actors had tried to write into being a different ocean, one that was defined by collectivist resource regimes rather than by interstate competition and the pursuit of profits. And while these proposed regimes were eventually subordinated to capitalist logic, the ocean as it was juridified continues to be contested today in different ways and at different sites. Obviously, the contestations are often unequal, especially when they take the form of rival ocean ordering projects of imperial or would-be imperial states and corporations on the one hand, and subaltern groups on the other. Each of the sites that I show you in the slide before you is full of such rivalries at the local and regional levels and is replete with contradictions. But even so, these contestations and contradictions are important for the work they do in keeping open the possibilities of rewriting the ocean through the law. It is then a problematic feature of much legal scholarship that it does not really engage with most of these contestations and rivalrous projects, especially beyond the Euro-American contexts. So when it comes to Southern world making in particular, rather than being theorized, historicized, critiqued, or analyzed in some way, it is often simply ignored or reduced to stereotypes of copycatting or extremism. Instead, much legal doctrinal work simply stabilizes the existing order and the dominant worldview that is reflected in the existing order of the ocean. And it does so by several means, including by championing almost hagiographically existing laws. So the 1982 UN Convention that I mentioned earlier is, for example, venerated as a constitution and yet is rarely assessed by the threshold of constitutionalism. The dominant order is stabilized and reproduced also by our readiness to pronounce on what is legal or illegal, while failing to critically examine how those very boundaries are constituted and in whose interests. And the dominant order is stabilized by our readiness, and I talk here about, again, legal scholars like myself, by our readiness to accept incremental and superficial acts of inclusion as somehow radical and game-changing developments. The slide before you has an example of this. The image is from a couple of years ago when some indigenous voices were finally given some time to speak at the International Seabed Authority in Kingston, Jamaica. This is the institution that oversees seabed mining. It took 30 years for these voices to be included. What they sought was already off the table, and their intervention was reduced to its aesthetic quality rather than its political content. And yet, despite all of this, there was much celebration of the progress, so to speak, represented by their very presence. So is this really decolonization? Now, I accept that we might have different ideas of what decolonization entails, and of course, we'll be discussing that in this webinar. But for legal scholars, it demands, at the minimum, a shift in our terms of engagement with Southern world making. Particularly, it demands that we develop the tools to take seriously Southern actors as intellectual innovators and as world makers, and that we bring to the fore what is sought, erased, and subordinated through the law, rather than simply celebrating what is achieved. Thank you very much. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you very much, Surabhi. I think before we take questions, I'll move on to Ashish and then Joe and Cyan. So Ashish from Radical Ecology, take it away.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Rosie, for helping out with the slides there. So yeah, my name is Ashish Ghadiali. I'm the director of an organisation called Radical Ecology. We're based in the southwest of England, in the coastal area of South Devon. Yeah, if we move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about a kind of, well, I've been asked to talk about the kind of approach that we have developed to decolonisation, and particularly arts-based methodologies for our work, that kind of is really largely around the subject of environmental justice, and constantly doing that from a kind of through a decolonial prism. A lot of the work that we're doing now really emerges out of a kind of a background in climate justice activism. So I was part of a grassroots collective called Wretched of the Earth. Around 2019, we authored as a collective an open letter to Extinction Rebellion that ended up being quite widely cited in academia and within cultural and arts institutions, and sort of laid out a framework, a kind of a kind of manifesto for a decolonial approach to climate justice. And off the back of that, I ended up leading on political strategy for the COP26 Civil Society Coalition, and momentarily getting very involved with the University of Exeter's climate science community at the Global Systems Institute, where we were thinking about the kind of about the structures inherent within the modelling of climate economics. So essentially, kind of looking at the mainstream macroeconomic theories of sort of William Nordhaus, the Nobel Prize winning economist, and looking at the way that inadvertently, by amplifying essentially kind of neoliberal models of economic growth onto the climate crisis, that the models that remain in mainstream use continue to essentially invisibilize, underestimate the impact on black and brown lives of global warming. I kind of present that as a kind of intro, because so the image that you're looking at in front of you is a graphic from our 2023 report for nature sustainability, quantifying the human cost of global warming. That really looks at exposure to extreme heat by population, and that metric, which we argue kind of points towards new approaches to the economics of climate change, also very clearly reflects a geography in which exposure to the impacts of global warming directly maps onto historic the maps of colonial and imperial expansion from the 16th century, and we see that climate vulnerability is a geographical reality that's very much determined by the historical structures of empire. So that decolonial, the decolonial approach of our arts work. If you want to move on to the next slide, Rosie, is sort of really grounded in that global analysis, and that kind of the imperial and the colonial kind of footprint that sits at the heart of the climate crisis. Another key part of our work is about sort of translating that Earth systems view at the level of organizations. So we work, so we take a kind of decolonial approach to our engagement with arts and heritage organisations in the UK. Since 2022, we've been with the UCL Sarah Parker Remond Centre for the Study of Racism and Racialisation, a co-convener of the Black Atlantic Innovation Network, working with cultural and heritage organisations, including the National Trust, Eden, the South Bank Centre, the Royal Botanical Gardens, to really look at work that is going on and has been going on around areas including equality, diversity and inclusion, net zero and sustainability, and decolonisation, often largely in the kind of programmatic space, and invited senior leadership across those organisations to consider what happens when we think about environmental justice as a framework that cuts across all of those silos, and that rather than sitting at the margins of an organisation, really comes to the centre as a strategy for future-proofing organisations against the kind of macro trends that organisations of different scales are often battling with. That work was presented in a framework for environmental justice, which we published in November and launched last year with the Museums Association. Rosie, if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. But these strategic pieces really kind of underpin our arts-based methodologies that constantly drive the work that we do in the southwest of England, where we're based. So so whilst thinking about impact and decolonial frames and decolonial agency at a kind of macro level or a global level and a national level, we're always thinking within the context in which we operate immediately, how do the narratives of empire continue to hold together the decision-making spaces, and it's where our our arts-based approaches really become the kind of way forward for us. Arts, we find that the artists that we work with are already at the forefront of finding ways, finding new languages in their own practices, that when brought together start to create public spaces that enable us to engage communities in slow and subtle but also transformative ways. So the images that you're looking at here, in the same year that we published a framework for quantifying the human cost of global warming in nature, and saw impact through media exposure in the Times of India and in Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. We also delivered this critically acclaimed exhibition against apartheid that brought the work of 14 artists and activists together in the centre of Plymouth, and we're able to start to draw connections for residents of Plymouth between this systems analysis and narratives of migration and histories of the triangular trade that's so deeply embedded in the fabric of that community. And we would have experiences where councillors would come in and be moved by the material in the exhibition, that city business leaders that are also engaged with the city's net zero project would come into the exhibition and be moved by the narrative. And it was these arts-based approaches that more than the hard analysis of the academic paper, that turned a kind of a decolonial critique of mainstream policy into something that has the kind of the breadth and inclusiveness of a kind of civil society project. Rosie, if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. Other examples of the work that we do using the arts include a project called Musical Passage, where we've been working again in Devon and Cornwall with young people to make connections between the jazz educators, the renowned jazz education organisation Tomorrow's Warriors, and music teachers across Devon and Cornwall, young people across Devon and Cornwall. Again, alongside the policy and the academic work that we've been doing, this arts-based approach actually draws out connections between historic cultural forms and the communities that we're seeking to engage. Other projects include Diversity in Gardens, where we've been making connections between refugees and asylum seekers in Devon and Cornwall. Plymouth has for the last 20 years and more been a strategic centre for the policy of dispersal, a kind of key pillar of the UK government's policy of hostile environment. We've made connections between refugees and asylum seekers and regenerative farms in Devon and Cornwall, again creating an opportunity for both the service users of, for example, Devon and Cornwall refugee support to experience the environment of the southwest of England as something less than hostile, but also creating the spaces for residents, residents, members of the settled community to engage with refugees and asylum seekers in a humane and humanizing structure. I could go on and give more examples. Last year we did an exhibition called Invasion Ecology at a gallery called South Combe Barn in Widdicombe in the Moor in Dartmoor, and that exhibition brought the work together of artists including the Turner Prize nominated Ingrid Pollard into a kind of rural community, relatively remote rural community, and started to engage a debate around Devon and Cornwall around the language of invasion ecology, the language of native and invasive species, asking questions about what that narrative means, both at the level of environmental management, but also the extent to which the language underpins dynamics of racism and racialization that we're addressing in other parts of our work. In an exhibition that's currently on at the Thelma Hulbert Gallery in Honiton, it's a solo exhibition of my own work, Sensing the Planet. Again, audience members are coming in and getting that that direct connection with a lot of the kind of policy and narrative work that we have been developing. Onto the next slide, please, Rosie. Thanks very much. So yeah, I think that one way of looking at why decolonisation is that there's this kind of participatory methodology that really sits at the heart of everything that we're doing. That's taken the form of participatory public performances. So in 2023, we led a silent walk in Plymouth. From the Mayflower Steps to the Peace Garden on Plymouth Hoe, walking around the Drake statue, and invited audience participants to, not to comment or to argue or to judge, but just to reflect on what those histories meant within the context of the wider environmental situation that we have been reflecting on. I guess that that question, participation, always feels like it's kind of ongoing. One moment of participation invites the next. And I think one of the questions that came up for us in that, we did a big part of that event also took place in Devonport, which is one of the highest areas of deprivation in the UK, let alone Plymouth, and we were kind of considering the challenges that we'd had in engaging community members in Plymouth, in Devonport itself. So, I mean, with it, the next month, I sort of signed up as a volunteer at the youth club in Devonport. And after a year of just supporting the youth club there, we made a 360 film about home, called Home, in which young people from the city reflected on the idea of what home means to them. We've also been working more recently with Natural England to explore questions around value in a woodland that is very local to our studio, thinking about the kind of the way in which commercial value, economic value, social value, and biodiversity value are often positioned in a triangle where they don't where they kind of where at least one of those is seen to be at odds with other parts of the triangle. And we've proposed with Natural England a 100-year care plan for that woodland that would actually enable local community members to address all three aspects of value of that value triangle at the same time. So hopefully that gives you some insight into our practice. Radical Ecology has existed since 2021. Sorry. It was very much improvised. It kind of, as an organisation, improvised out of a kind of broad spectrum of activity. Rosie, if we go on to the last slide. But yeah, that gives you a bit of a sort of sense of the flavour of the kind of the way that work has taken shape, and what and what the kind of embodied meaning of decolonisation is within the work that has taken shape. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ashish. I think that's you have captured a lot in there. So we've heard quite extensively about the academic work around the international law of the sea from Surabhi. We've gone on to Ashish and grassroots work in the southwest, and now we're going on to Joe Ogogo, who's from CEFAS. CEFAS, well, you can explain, Joe, what CEFAS do. So over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. I hope everybody is well. I am Joe Ogogo. I am our EDI lead at CEFAS, and I'm going to talk you through our approach to EDI holistically, but also with a focus on race and racism. So this is a relatively new post. The post has been established for about a year now, so I've been with CEFAS about a year, but prior to that I have about 15 years experience in EDI and organisational change. I was really fortunate actually, because prior to my role starting, we did have some really good work already being done in this sphere. So we have our Tackling Racism at CEFAS network, which is co-chaired by Kieran and James, which is then underpinned by support from the SLT, and all the EDI work we've done is then underpinned and supported by our head of people and culture, which is Claire Viala. So we do have some staff networks, but for the perspective for this, I will talk around EDI holistically, but also with a focus on race. So when I came into this role, it was really, really important that I had an idea of where we were as an organisation. I wanted to ensure that our interventions frameworks going forward were bespoke and fit for purpose, and therefore I conducted a maturity assessment. Now, this involved a diagnostic stage where I'd done a familiarisation of all our policies and our procedures just to ensure that they were inclusive. We also done some one-to-one interviews, some focus groups, and an EDI survey. And what this really allowed us to do is capture all elements of the organisation. I really wanted to understand where we were on an organisation, so I knew how we could then accelerate and leverage where we needed to go. So the findings of our maturity assessment, I scored CEFAS around about a 1.5, which is between compliant and emerging, and that means that there's obviously quite a lot of work to do. Our aim is to meet a strategic position by the end of 2026. We've got an action plan now. Our strategy is launched. We're now starting to implement some of our findings. Now, some of our key messages, which came from the maturity assessment, was around accountability and transparency. So we really wanted our leaders to role model inclusive behaviours. We needed to promote our external brand and reputation. We needed to continue with growth and engagement, allowing people to have those safe conversations, allowing people to grow and engage in these difficult conversations. Inclusive recruitment. We needed to ensure that our processes were transparent, they were de-biased, and they were inclusive. We needed to continue to collect data. I mean, we are quite lucky. We have a really good data set. We just needed to make sure we continue to use that to drive decision making. And we also needed to make sure we provided safety and support. So really addressing our bullying and harassment and actually increasing our psychological safety. So from our findings, then we then looked at 4 focus areas. So we've got leadership that inspires, a culture of inclusion, harnessing diverse and inclusive talent, and our external impact. So these are our 4 focus areas. And because we noticed and identified that our main challenges were in the talent pipeline, that is where we've put our focus in. But we actually also need to make sure we still work on our culture, because we need to create the right culture for our colleagues to thrive. So how this then links into decolonising racism within our workforce. So what we really want to do is increase diverse representation. We need to start building a talent pipeline with an early intervention. So we've started to do a lot of work with primary schools, having conversations around marine biology, the ocean, the environment, all those really, really early conversations at primary school, because we know by the time we get to secondary school, a lot of children have already decided what it is they want to do. So we're missing out on a big audience there. So we start to do a lot of early intervention work. We're also reviewing our recruitment processes. We've recently done an ethnicity pipeline review, and shockingly, the headline statistic was that if you apply for a job at CEFAS as a white person, you're 8 times more likely to get offered that position. Now, when we dissected that even further, we realised that SIF stage is when we were losing most of our potential candidates. So we need to start working on how we're going to challenge those stereotypes and make sure that our processes are really inclusive. We also need to then start addressing our barriers, looking at our bias, our stereotypes within that pipeline, and then again start looking at how we can make them more inclusive. We also need to create the right culture to support ethnically diverse colleagues. What I've seen before with lots of different organisations is that they really focus on increasing diverse representation, but actually then neglect the culture. So although we then might see an increase of representation, if the culture's there, we cannot then retain and develop that talent. So we then see people leave. So creating that culture is so important to making sure that we when we do increase that representation, we can retain that talent as well. Creating safe spaces for honest and open conversations about race and racism. That there's still that kind of elephant in the room. People don't want to talk about it. People don't want to get it wrong. People don't know what to say. So really bring it right down to basics and having those honest and open conversations. Providing ongoing learning and upskilling, and encouraging challenge. And this is a key thing, that there's a lack of psychological safety and support in terms of people calling out inappropriate behaviours. We need to get to a place where people can confidently and effectively challenge. And we also need to look at allyship. And again, this kind of coincides with privilege and how you can use your privilege to be an ally. So what that means for us in terms of what have we actually done. So I'm just going to talk you through a couple of things of what we've started to do. To really start to look at psychological safety, which again is key across all elements of EDI, but particularly with race. There is still that big barrier there. So allowing people to have the conversations, allowing people to get it wrong, and actually shifting the narrative and power. We've started to talk a lot about language and the impact of language. So we've started to do some inclusive language sessions. So even moving away from terms like ethnic minority, minority ethnic, and actually having that positive element of it, ethnically diverse, global majority. Things so small and simple as that can actually have a big impact. We've started to improve there. We've started to raise awareness and confidence through upskilling. So we've actually been quite bold and took on the conversation of privilege, which has been really eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people, and actually understanding what privilege looks like. And there's that saying where you have to kind of go back to look forward, and it's about really unpicking that racism, really unpicking that systemic, that ingrained, that institutional racism. What does that look like, and how does that still present now? How do we see that? also then considering the covert and the overt elements of that as well. So being really bold and having those conversations, and also helping people to feel comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that's a key thing, getting people to have these uncomfortable conversations. There's also been a real element of acknowledging where people are in this conversation. And when I talk about doing an organisational wide maturity assessment, actually there's a personal reflection piece there as well, because people come into this conversation with their own experiences, their own backgrounds, and actually that can have a big impact as well. So it's about stripping that back, being really honest and open about where people are, and adapting the content and the conversation to be able to bring people along the journey. We need to take bold and intentional and transparent actions. There's that, intention is a wonderful thing, but unless we then translate those intentions into actions, we are not going to move the dial, and we're going to be having the same conversation in 20 years' time, not seeing any change. So it's about being really bold, and I think at CEFAS we are going to be bold. We are going to actually implement some changes. We're now looking at we've started to develop a inclusive recruitment program, where the expectation will be for all hiring managers to enroll on that training course, which is going to help them to address their bias, address their barriers, address their stereotypes. So being really bold in our approach, holding up the mirror, and again, if we're not honest about where we are, we can't move forward. We are starting to redefine our policies and processes to ensure they are equitable. And we're really starting to use data and evidence to drive our interventions. Like I said, the headline figure of the pipeline for 8 times more likely if you're white. And also we want to start looking at doing an ethnicity pay gap, because I think that's going to be really interesting as well. We know that there's been some disparities in terms of our pay and reward. Ethnically diverse colleagues are less likely to receive a reward, and when they do, it's usually around £150 lower than white colleagues. So again, we need to start looking at how we can bridge that gap. And also about broadening participation and engagement. I think sometimes people think that this is just a problem for people who are ethnically diverse, but actually in reality it's everybody's problem, and we all have to get involved and we all have to play our part. And obviously we need to have leadership, driving this and promoting this, but actually we all have our place to play. We all have to contribute, otherwise we are not going to see any movement. So we are moving in the right direction. I think we are now starting to have conversations. We are being very honest and open, but it does require that really bold, honest, transparent approach to be able to move the dial. And unless we start doing that, we just won't be able to move forward. So lots of positives, lots of things to look forward to, and I am really excited and keen to continue to support CEFAS on our journey. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jo. I'm super excited to hear about more what you're planning on doing, and I think every organisation should have a Jo.
Thank you. Thank you.
So from another breath of fresh air to my final breath of fresh air, the Cyan Deslanders from the University of Plymouth, and yeah, so you're well, you can talk to us about what the work you're doing and your route into marine sciences.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Just bear with me 1 second. So, as mentioned, I am a second-year student at the University of Plymouth, but I am also the founder of Mermaids Beyond Borders. So I just want to firstly say thank you to the Ocean Coastal Futures team for allowing me and giving me the opportunity to share Mermaids Beyond Borders with you guys today. And I'm incredibly grateful for this space and to be surrounded by people who care deeply about the justice in the ocean space. So as I said, my name is Cyan Deslanders. And this initiative was born out of a dream and a frustration to make ocean science more accessible, more inclusive, and more representative of the world that we live in. For too long, marine conservation and ocean science has felt out of reach for many, whether it's due to financial barriers, lack of representation, or simply not seeing people who look like you or come from where you come from. This field hasn't always felt like an open door, but Mermaids Beyond Borders exists to change that. We believe that knowledge should not have any borders, and through cultural exchange, collaboration, and digital storytelling, we're building a platform where young people around the world can connect, learn, and grow together, no matter where you're from, what you look like, or what challenges you might face. We're breaking down barriers, whether by sharing free educational resources, spotlighting incredible conservation stories from island nations and coastal communities, or creating a safe, welcome spaces for youth to raise their voices. And the name, well, that comes from my mom. She always called me a mermaid ever since I was little. I think I'd spend more time in the sea than I do on land. So when I started this project, it only felt right to honor that part of me. Because Mermaids Beyond Borders isn't just about science, it's about hearts, heritage, and home. Because if the ocean has no borders, why should we? So if you guys share this vision, we'd love to connect. You can find us on Instagram, you can find us on LinkedIn, as well as you can always send us an email. The ocean belongs to all of us, and the knowledge to protect it, well, that should all belong to us too. So thank you again so much for the Coastal Futures team for the platform, and thank you all for listening. I hope that conversations today inspire new ideas, collaborations, and most of all, a more just and connected future for our oceans. Thank you.
Thanks, Cyan. That was incredible. So I wanted to firstly thank all of our speakers today, our panelists. That's it was really, for me, it was quite enlightening on so many levels. But you know, to find a room where I've essentially found some kindred spirits in many ways to talk about decolonisation in a way that is kind of accessible and tangible to a lot of people. And I've been thinking about, you know, how we move on to the next stage. So the questions, Q&A sessions. And but what I really wanted to do before I move on to that was kind of talk about a little bit about decolonisation more broadly. And we've all come at it, the panelists have all come at it from a different perspective. It covers, we've all spoken about what academic work looks like, what community activism and grassroots organisations could look like. We've looked at institutional racism, and now we've looked at, the early careers part of marine sciences and actually moving beyond borders to be inclusive. So I guess with that in mind, and before I open out to other attendees, I wanted to know what decolonisation means for you as individuals and also to your organisation. So can I start off with Surhabi, please?
Sure, absolutely. I might speak for my field rather than for my organization, just because it's my presentation was more academic. But I think there are, I would say, and this is, I suppose, as also a priority for the field, decolonisation, I think for us has to have both epistemic and material components. So there's this question of whose ideas get written into the law, where do these ideas come from, whose understanding. So we, I think Cyan said very nicely that the ocean belongs to all of us, and that's a perspective that gets mentioned at many lawmaking conferences, and yet somehow it's only the problem is it's always mentioned as a sort of aesthetic thing that everybody sort of appreciates it, but that's not the perspective that gets translated into the law, where the law is sort of written in response to very particular interests, right? So notionally, the ocean belongs to all of us, and yet it's handed over piecemeal to a bunch of corporations who get to extract its resources from it. And so there's definitely this epistemic question, but linked to that is this material question. So whose voices do we hear is very, very important, but also what do we do once we hear those voices? What do we actually make of those perspectives? So what is not just our politics of listening, but what is our politics of translating what we listen to into the regimes that then shape the fate both of the oceans and of all of those who depend on the oceans, which is actually, if we think about all the kinds of functions the oceans perform, that's all of us. So, it has to be both epistemic and material, and has to come down to what are the actual regimes that allow engagement with, participation in, and benefits from the ocean, and to whom.
Yeah, thank you. And
sorry, could I just say, just link to that, could I say that I think it's also interesting, I was thinking about it as everybody else was speaking, that of course part of the problem is also that the field of international law, the field of law more broadly, but certainly international law, also suffers from some of the same patterns that everyone else has described, right? It is traditionally a field that has been open to, Europeans, Western scholars. It's not been as open to scholars from elsewhere. The perspectives that have shaped it traditionally have been the perspectives of, colonizers and imperialists. So there's a large body of work called Third World Approaches to International Law, which makes the point that international law was basically produced together with colonialism. And so it keeps reproducing colonialism through its operations. And most of the people who get to participate in the field are people who are sort of, already trained in colonial traditions. So there's a huge process of sort of relearning or unlearning that is also demanded of lawyers. And this, again, goes beyond just where people come from, but also what they get trained in and what they end up doing with their work. And so that's why I talked about how doctrinally legal scholars end up often reproducing, sort of hegemonic and dominant worldviews, even against the evidence that there's a lot of work going on the ground that is trying to remake the ocean in much more interesting and more radical ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Ashish, what are your thoughts on decolonisation?
So, I mean, I agree with everything that has just been said, and I think that in a way, it's it is that sort of that double bind, isn't it? That so much of the world, the global structures, the global, the local, the structures that we inhabit are so profoundly shaped by a relatively recent history, right? 300-400 years. Of European imperialism, so that we sort of sit struggling to disentangle the inequality, the racial hierarchy that has informed all of these values that we have all been raised, where in lots of parts of the world, not just in the global north, to believe as higher values. And so we are sitting on this kind of this complex imperial legacy, and I think decolonisation is a process. And for me, the climate crisis is the thing that really brings that to the fore. It's like, we attribute it to this and, this behavior and that, and we think it's about the carbon, but actually, a lot of my work is about looking at that map and going, well, what this is just the story of empire writ large, and where that confusion, for in terms of racial equality, like where that confusion often it plays out when we don't do, say, EDI through a decolonial prism. We basically have no world on which to hold on our kind of assumptions, and it becomes very confused. And we see that all the time in the political discourse, that actually leaders, organizations, moments of political discourse move attempt to move in the direction of racial equality or inclusion, and then it gets pushed back from another, from a completely other pole, so that Donald Trump is able to sign presidential order, executive orders in which he says, I am going to eradicate I'm going to dismantle the racist field of critical race theory, right? Like, so decolonisation is a prism that actually restores order to the universe and allows us to escape that that very confusing space that is the mainstream in which we operate right now.
Yeah, and I want to come back on the political discourses as well. I'll speak to that in a minute, but I wanted to hear from Joe, who is currently in the heart of an institution CEFAS and government. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, thank you. I think obviously we know that there's the structures, the policies in place, which sometimes we don't have a lot of impact. We haven't got a lot of influence on there. So I think a lot of the work in recent years is about actually changing what I know I can change within the sphere that I can change. So a lot of that for me is hearts and minds. So if we can get people to acknowledge where they are, if we can get people to acknowledge their history, if we can get people to acknowledge their own biases, their own stereotypes, if we can challenge that, and if we can get one person to think in a different way or to consider something different, that is how we do it, step by step. It's about changing the minds and attitudes of people that we work with, people in decision-making roles, leadership, people in leadership position. And that, I think, step by step is how we do it. And that requires ongoing reflection, self-reflection, learning, and it's about putting yourself out there. To be able to learn and grow, you have to have a good, hard look at yourself. And I think that is how we shift the dial, is by changing the hearts and minds of people.
Yeah. Thank you. And Cyan, as an early careers researcher, what would you like to see from the organisations, academic, grassroots and government organisations?
So I do agree with everybody else, what they said. I think that decolonization, to me, it means like returning power and space and recognition to people who's been left out of the conversation. I think a lot of times, as mentioned before, like a lot of times we talk about the fact that we need to make ocean science more inclusive and more accessible. However, there's no real push towards that. So I love to see it being truly accessible. And that's what decolonization means for like even Mermaids Beyond Borders. Like we want to make it truly accessible and valuing the diverse ways of knowing from Western spaces. I think traditional knowledge is also very important in this sector. Especially cultures like mine. You're talking about people who have grown up with the ocean. They know things from before there was like a degree in ocean science. So I think hearing those kind of diverse voices is very much needed in this space. And it's not really about, to me, it wouldn't be about dismantling old systems, but it's about creating something better, a more just or joyful, united ocean movement. And that's basically what I think it is.
I don't know if Gurpreet's is frozen there or dropped out. So if I can quickly just step in there, I'm just noticing a lot of questions coming in on the Q&A really, and just trying to pick up some of them here. I come to you, Joe. It's a very specific one for you around CEFAS, if you don't mind, panelists. Just Joe, it says, is the work CEFAS are doing replicated across all of UK/England government agencies such as the Environment Agency, MMO, etc.?
Yes and no. I think we've taken a bit of a different approach and we're governed by similar boundaries to things that we can and can't do, but I think it's quite heavily led by the organisational needs. And I think this is the key thing about doing a maturity assessment, because you then identify what those needs are. Our needs will look very different to core DEFRA, will look very different to another arm's length body. So it's about understanding where we are so we can put the right interventions in place. I think we're all working towards the same goal, but obviously our barriers and concerns will look differently to other parts of the government organisations.
Thank you. That's great. Another quite specific question here. Legally, if the high seas belong to no single nation, how do we begin to call for reparations, ocean justice, and protect our oceans in the future from deep sea mining with tighter activism laws and decreasing funds for the ocean sector? So I guess that's talking about, I suppose, the commons that is the high seas really, and how, while no single nation may own it, how do we look for reparations and justice around all of that in relation to deep sea mining? Yeah, would anybody like to have a go? I'm sure that
I think should I take this?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I think this is such a good question because this was precisely the kind of battle that played out in the 60s and 70s, right? So the terminology of reparations was not used very much, but there was a very clear sense that what needed to be done was a complete rewriting of the law of the sea precisely to produce new regimes that would have the function of sort of creating a post-colonial legal order, right? Which would be an order which would distribute the benefits of activities that had been traditionally only imperial activities to all sorts of people, all sorts of states and peoples who depended on the oceans. And that was the sort of world-making project that didn't materialize. But those battles continue today as well. So what we have is, so the high seas, you're right, don't belong to anyone. And yet the high seas are not, as is sort of often supposed, a lawless space. They're actually, the high seas are extremely sort of legalized. And what the law does is it distributes the rights and sort of freedoms and constraints on the high seas and the deep sea bed separately, but both in ways that essentially give the benefits of these places to particular corporations and distribute the costs to everyone else. And there's the entire sort of, and the contestations that I was talking about earlier are very much to do with trying to essentially reverse that, to suggest that the cost should be borne by those who have made historic uses of the sea and have historically polluted the oceans and depleted its biodiversity, and the benefit should be more widely shared. So there is work going on. There's an effort to sort of remake international laws. With the high seas, we've seen, for example, the BBNJ, the Agreement on Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction, that tried to create a regime for distributing the economic benefits of accessing marine genetic resources in an equitable way. That had partial success. With seabed mining, again, we saw the effort to create a regime that could actually not only distribute the benefits of seabed resources, but also turn seabed mining into a collectivist activity, because a lot of post-colonials, they said what they didn't want was a replication of the old colonial dynamic, where they basically served as sites for the extraction of minerals and as markets of finished goods. They wanted to have participation in this advanced regime in more direct ways. That battle didn't work out then. And what is going on now is this movement. And this is where it gets interesting, because on the one hand, there's a kind of interesting, important environmental movement that says, look, don't mine the seabed because it's going to be ecologically extremely harmful. And so they're calling for what is essentially a pause or a moratorium for 10 or 20 years until the ocean can be studied better. But what you also have coming through a few voices, but sort of the indigenous voices that I mentioned in my presentation, is a different kind of argument. Not only are they saying don't mine the seabed now, but they're also saying you can't mine it on the same the politico-economic terms on which the regime has currently been defined. So it can't be a competitive regime. It can't be a for-profit regime. If seabed mining happens in the future, it must be on a very different basis, so that indigenous people who see the ocean as their ocean get actual economic benefits from such activities. And so there is certainly a battle. The law is important because it provides a site for the articulation of these different claims and interests. The question really is what happens in terms of outcomes. And there the success is more incremental, it's more partial, and it really leaves open this question of whether decolonization, in what ways can reparations truly be realized through legal regimes.
Thank you for that. That's great. Yeah, and I think with the BBNJ negotiations, as you mentioned, they happen over the next few years, and countries signing up and ratifying it or not. I think it'll be an interesting space to watch, isn't it? Just another question, which is, I guess, to all of you really, and I'll start with you, Ashish. Does the panel think there's an understanding of what decolonizing means by government? So really, I guess government in its broader sense, either the central government departments or agencies you kind of work with. Ashish, I'll start with you.
I mean, it's obviously a very contentious term, isn't it? And I think government, I think the dominant attitude in government, today in the UK is that that's not it's not an appropriate terminology to use. That said, part of what my organisation does is work with organisations to we work with many different organisations, including government organisations, and we don't necessarily insist on the term. So, for example, the Black Atlantic Innovation Network started out as a kind of project to basically bring together organisations, not government organisations, but the National Trust is a kind of is a charity that kind of everyone assumes is a government organisation, and we were looking at this work around decolonisation, how to protect it by possibly changing the name. So actually that's where the framework for environmental justice sort of came about. And then over time, actually there was a sea change in attitude within the National Trust. And actually by the time we went out with the report, they were like, we love this word, you should use it more, more forthright, so it sort of goes up and down. But I would say that in the central government, I couldn't imagine FCDO anytime soon saying we're going to now lay out our decolonial agenda. At the same time, I have had a role as advisor to the decolonisation and representation process for Plymouth City Council. So it exists in some places. We're very scared of it as a culture, and I think that that's real work to do. I think it would be a great cultural achievement if, say, 10 years from now, we were able to have a sane conversation about the fact that and obviously we've seen these huge shifts in understanding about the historic legacies of slavery and empire, within our culture. The shifts have already started to happen. There is a much more mainstream acceptance of a decolonial premise. And I think it's just a matter of time, really, before the word itself becomes something that we actually are allowed to use, and can without embarrassment or fear.
Gurpreet, I'll hand back to you.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, my internet is a bit dodgy, but okay, so I have a view. I think we're getting more comfortable at using the word decolonisation. I think there is a fear that decolonisation is rooted in reparations, and reparations is only like money exchanging from British taxpayers over to the global south, and it's not really like that. So my mindset had shifted when I went to South Carolina, and I went to a plantation, and what they've done there is, so the former landowners, what they were doing was kind of investing in educational programs, and sharing that. Well, it was reframed. So reparations and decolonisation have been reframed to kind of give back to communities, and what that looks like now for people who were historically enslaved, and and also engaging with historically Black colleges and universities, and being okay with having organisations that are Black and Brown led, and being comfortable. I'm not sure, and I'm not convinced that Britain is there yet. I'm not convinced it will ever be there. I do think, though, the cynic in me does think that when the going gets tough, then it's easier to lean on marginalized communities, and I think that and start engaging with them, because where else do we go? We're at this crisis, climate crisis, point of climate crisis, and biodiversity loss, and there's also fighting over resources here. So there's a divide between rich and poor. So when you talk about issues related to poverty, people of colour, lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to lose out. So that's when words like decolonisation, reparations, and all of that become extremely toxic. But I think that we are getting better at using that in government, and I think that we've just got to continue pushing to be able to have that in everyday language. Yeah, that's my rant. Does anyone else have anything more to say, or have you already been through it? So
actually, if could I jump in for 1 second to say, so 2 years ago, the House of Lords had a really interesting inquiry where they looked into, so it was 40 years of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and the inquiry was basically, is it still fit for purpose in this 40 years later? with climate crisis, with all the perils that confront the ocean, and with all the challenges, economic and social, does the law of the sea need to be rewritten? I would just refer that report to everyone, because I think it's actually quite an interesting report. It was a long inquiry. They collected evidence from a whole, host of stakeholders, and they thought about what are the various ways in which you could translate all the issues that confront the ocean into ocean justice initiatives that are forward looking. So I think they're taking on board the point you made about it's not just about money and so on, because at some level also these calculations of money become very difficult. So there's one Indian Marxist, for instance, who's calculated that if money had to be repaid, then the British Empire, the Britain would have to repay India something like 44 trillion for and this is and that sort of thing is not possible. So instead, what the report does is it thinks about what kinds of reconstructed regimes would be that could we have that would be forward looking and that would address both the perils confronting the ocean and sort of provide a role for the UK in moving forward in terms of leadership on ocean justice issues.
Thank you. So I'm going to go down. I think we've got time for one more question. Let's go up. All right. As an early career scientist, I've been hired under multiple EDI initiatives across different environmental organisations, and personally have found them tokenistic. And the minute I start to talk about colonialism, racism, etc., I'm out the door. How, as a person of colour, do we find inclusive roles without having to educate the organisations themselves, or is the sector just not there yet? I suppose we all touched on it, but I was wondering if anyone had any further thoughts on that. Joe?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good question. If we're being really honest and transparent, I don't think they're there yet. And I think we've got a long way to go, and it shouldn't come on the shoulders of Black and brown people to continually retell the story or to continue to educate, but we are just not there yet. And I think I definitely come into a government organisation, had to lower my expectations, which is again much more done the maturity assessment to understand where we are. Unfortunately, it's I don't like you, it's a journey, isn't it? But we have to start somewhere. We're not there yet, but this is why this kind of conversations and work is so important, because we will get there, hopefully, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, thanks. And Cyan, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on this as well as an early career
so
scientist.
this one, yeah, definitely hit home, because I really feel this. I think that a lot of us as early career scientists are brought under that EDI banner, but then expected to stay silent about systems that make those expected to stay silent about those systems that need changing. I don't think that the sector is fully there yet either. There's still a lot of work to be done. But what gives me hope is the community being built outside of those systems. So spaces like this, so global youth networks, and new initiatives as well. I really wish I had a clean answer on how to find safe, inclusive roles. But I do think, and even out of experience, I do think that it's about finding people who value your full self, and not just a vision that fits into the brand. And it's okay to walk away from places that don't want your identity, but that want your identity but don't want your truth. So I think until the system changes, we keep building our own and lifting up each other in the process. Yes.
And Ashish?
Well, I was just going to say that I think that challenge that I'm sure we all face, and it is the reason that a decolonial approach and framework is the thing that's worth fighting for, because actually while we limit the argument to one about identities and equalities in the workplace. Actually, all of that is underpinned by a kind of logic that no one quite names, but which is so, because what it's lived as is just, this is the way things work, right? And now you're making it all about race. So I think that the kind of the point that was made about this being epistemic, first and foremost, it's like, actually it's really worth our time as a community to really now, at this point in history, to really invest in the narrative and the analysis of why the perpetuation of empire as a structure is not sustainable. It's not sustainable from an environmental point of view. It's not sustainable from an economic point of view. It's not desirable from a social point of view, and we actually that isn't a radical position any longer. I mean, as long as we're able to patiently continue to make that argument and point towards a process that identifies those systemic dysfunctions and then points in another direction. And it's like, once we are able, whether we're racialized people or not, to start working together towards a kind of a decolonial objective, actually these questions around equalities and identities can start to work themselves out.
I completely agree with that and all the views shared. Sadly, this session does have to come to a close. I wish we could continue for another few hours, but we can't. I would like to say, firstly, thanks to Ocean and Coastal Futures for hosting us. I'd also like to say thanks to the panelists here today, so Surabhi, Ashish, Joe and Cyan. The recording will be on the OCF website and YouTube channel, and look out for the next webinar in the Ocean Justice series coming soon. So thank you everybody for watching, and goodbye. Thank you.